It does not allow negatively charged proteins to leave. Potassium is something that can kind of move back and forth fairly readily, but there are some forces that oppose that movement, the attraction of the positive potassium ion to negatively charged proteins. So this stuff in the center here is trying to help you understand why at resting membrane potential there is a charge difference across the membrane. Okay? Now the big thing about action potential is that membrane permeability changes pretty dramatically during action potential. And when that happens, ions move and they carry their charges along. It changes the potential. We go from resting to threshold potential and then action potential. Okay? This is showing you something from your book. All right? Now this one is showing chemically gated ion channels like we've heard about already. What we heard at the end plate, the neuromuscular junction, was that there were ligand-gated ion channels. We probably saw that the ligand-gated ion channel at the neuromuscular junction, this would be on the sarcolemma, was able to interact with a neurotransmitter, and by interacting with its neurotransmitter would open its gate, a conformational change that was temporary. What's being shown on here is that these gates that are found in synapses, in the membranes of neurons, at synapses, do the same thing that they do at end plates. They open up when there's a neurotransmitter present, and as a result, they change the permeability of the cell. What we see here is that sodium is being excluded and potassium is. Sodium would like to come into the cell. It's in high concentration on the outside of the neuron. Potassium would love to exit. It's in high concentration inside the neuron. With a closed gate, it's not going to happen. What's going to open these gates? The right neurotransmitter, a specific neurotransmitter that fits into that space. Who provides us neurotransmitters? Neurons that are presynaptic. Okay? A neuron is communicating with another, releasing neurotransmitter that can open this gate. One big change that comes from a change from my education and maybe some of yours is that this book is trying to indicate that the ligand-gated ion channel at the synapse is a bidirectional channel, that it allows sodium in, allows potassium out. Okay? So that's a change for me. I was always taught that these were sodium gates, that there was no potassium movement. Okay? This is a voltage-gated ion channel, which you may remember from sarcolemma. These are present in the sarcolemma away from the neuromuscular junction. If you're not following me on these terms, please ask. Okay? All right? So this one shows not a chemically gated ion channel, but one that is sensitive to polarity across the membrane and polarity changes. That's kind of the cool thing. I don't know if you're hooking into any of this. That's one of the cool things about these proteins is that electrical changes occurring nearby them literally change the shape of the protein temporarily to open the gate, as you can see right there. Okay? So I know we've heard about these before, but I just wanted to mention it again, that changes in potential across the membrane nearby begin to alter the shape and structure, and not structure, but shape of this thing to allow it to open. These gates and channels, okay, are present in the neurolemma, the membrane of the neuron, just like they are in the sarcolemma, okay? Differences in plasma membrane. By the way, I just to really blow the whole day, I left all my notes and everything at home. Okay, so I don't have anything to go on, so I'm going to be looking at the screen quite a bit. Or I'll look at this here. I'll just stand here like this and speak. Okay? Impermeable to large anionic proteins. This is one of the keys to membrane potential, is that proteins that carry a negative charge remain just under the membrane of the neuron, where they exert their force. Their force is they have a negative charge and they attract positive charges. Okay? So why care about this, about them being proteins? Well, we remember that proteins don't pass across membranes very well at all. So they're kind of stuck in the cell. They can't leave. and they therefore exert their negative influence, not in a personality way, but in an attraction way, okay? All right, so that's important to remember. By having all those negatively charged proteins in there and the fact that they're not going anywhere, they sort of attract positive charge to stay in place. Slightly permeable to sodium, this is the membrane of a neuron, but much more permeable to potassium, even at rest, okay? I was thinking about this on the way in, stupid, driving through Medina, Summit County, thinking about what I'm going to say in class, and, I was thinking about how potassium's kind of always leaving the cell, but there's some resistance to that leaving because of these things. Positive and negative charges are attracted to one another. And then, of course, the sodium-potassium pump is always bringing it right back in. So potassium's always leaving these neurons, but always being pumped right back in. If you remember, the sodium-potassium pump, 2 sodiums get pumped out for every 3 potassiums in. So if that thing's always working, it is helping to create this imbalance in ions, okay? So a little bit of sodium comes into the cell, obviously enough to be picked up and pumped back out, but a lot of potassium is sort of always leaking out, okay? All right. So we have the basic idea, the environment that the neuron finds itself in. A lot of sodium on the outside, chloride ion, negatively charged on the outside, fair amount of potassium on the inside, more than there is on the outside, but there's potassium on the outside as well, and there's chloride on the outside. Now, it says that the membrane is quite permeable to chloride. How come we don't get a ton of chloride on the inside of the cell? You guys are great, okay? You guys are really awesome. You make my job very easy. You're thinking about the fact that negatives and negatives are not attracted to one another. The last thing before we leave this, it may sound nutty, but proteins are large enough and contain a variety of amino acids, and some of those amino acids ionize. And when they ionize, that is, they'll drop off a hydrogen ion, leaving behind an O negative. That's how they get anionic, if you're following me here. Okay, really good. Okay. So, if the concentrations of ions across the membrane change, and we reach threshold, then we're going to get a big change in permeability. So, as we open ion gates at synapses, we're going to begin to change potential across the membrane, and if we get the threshold, then there's going to be a big permeability change. You know what that means. Let a lot of sodium in, let a lot of potassium out, and then put things back together. Wanted to point out again this term graded potential, because many of the signals that reach a neuron are not strong enough to cause it to reach action potential. However, if it's receiving multiple graded potentials that move it towards threshold, threshold can be reached. Don't get too hung up on this, but understand, if a neuron has synapses with 10, or let's say a single neuron has 10,000 synapses coming to it, some of those synapses are going to be sending excitatory signals, some of them are going to be sending inhibitory signals, and it's the sum of these signals that tell us whether we get to hear or not, okay? So there can be incremental signals, and if they sum up to threshold, action potential. If they don't, the neuron can literally be inhibited, okay? So this is something different now from skeletal muscle. The neuron can actually be hyperpolarized or inhibited from responding. And that's a signal in the nervous system as well. One quick thing, the nervous system definitely is interested in whether action potential exists and how frequently they come. So as we increase action potential frequencies in the nervous system, that's a type of signal. As we decrease action potential frequencies, that's a form of signal as well. It's not just always excitement that tells the nervous system something's happening. It's actually quiescence that also tells the nervous system that something is happening. Okay? If that makes any sense to you. Okay, so this is just showing a graded potential. All right? So, millivolt scale, oscilloscope trace, we can see it up there. A probe inside the neuron, a probe on the outside of the neuron, looking at potential across the membrane. There is positive 50, there's negative 70. Typically, the neuron's resting membrane potential, about negative 70 millivolts. And this is simply showing a change across the neuron's membrane in the positive direction. You'll notice it doesn't reach some imaginary line that says threshold. It's a graded potential. The neuron has not entered AP where we know it's going to go all the way to positive 20 and then come back down again. Okay? So this is very realistic. A neuron receives a signal that causes it to depolarize a little. All right? Now, if we send more signals quickly, then we can get it to depolarize a lot. This is called hyperpolarization, and this is interesting, in my opinion, because now we're seeing that the neuron can literally be inhibited. All right? An increase in membrane potential away from zero or away from depolarized. It is further polarizing, it's hyperpolarizing. The neuron then becomes less sensitive to signals in a hyperpolarized state. Let's take a look at this here, okay? So let's say that threshold is at negative 50 millivolts, okay? And there are hyperpolarizing signals coming in, deflecting the neuron away from threshold. We now have to have depolarizing signals that are not only enough to reach threshold, but greater than reaching threshold. That is, we have to make up for the hyperpolarizing and then add on to it additional depolarizing to reach threshold. Do you follow me on this? A neuron that is hyperpolarized is less sensitive to normal signals. It's still sensitive, but less sensitive to normal signals. The nervous system uses this concept to control whether a neuron reaches AP or not. What could lead to hyperpolarization? This is another one for Monday morning. Okay. What can lead to hyperpolarization? We notice that the inside of the cell is becoming more negative to the outside. More negative than it is at resting membrane potential. Give me two ions, either one entering the cell or one leaving the cell, that can lead to this phenomenon. Potassium leaving, taking its positive charge with it. Takes its positive charge out of the cell, leaving more negative behind. What's another one? One that we haven't really seen as a major player, but now we need to see it as a player. Chloride ion coming in. The membrane is not that permeable to sodium at rest. But chloride is fairly permeable too. So as chloride can come into the cell, then it brings its negative charge, which depresses this further. The neuron may have ligand-gated chloride ion channels that respond to inhibitory neurotransmitters. A neurotransmitter may cause a ligand-gated chloride ion gate to open. Chloride will enter the cell, hyperpolarizing the cell. Okay? A neurotransmitter may open up a potassium ion gate that lets potassium out of the cell, lets the positive charge leave. That will be an inhibitory neurotransmitter that does that. Excitatory neurotransmitters then open sodium ion gates to let sodium into the cell and deflect away from resting membrane potential. You follow me on these things?
Is that the negative Cl that we keep reading? Is that the chloride negative?
Yes, Cl minus. Yes, chloride ion, right. Okay? So sodium's important, but now we see potassium and chloride are important as well. Okay? Also, I'll point out this is a great situation where if potassium floods the external environment of a neuron, a lot more potassium out there than there normally is. Maybe ate a dozen bananas or something, okay? And this potassium passed the blood-brain barrier and went into the central nervous system. You'd flood the external environment with potassium, more potassium would come into the cell, okay? All right, just because of basic diffusion. You got a lot more potassium out there, you're gonna get more coming into the cell. What effect does that have on the cell? The cell depolarizes, okay? Just because of the potassium ion concentration being messed up. A depolarized neuron is not controllable. Depolarized neurons are going to lead to malfunctions in the nervous system under these conditions now, okay? Flooding it with potassium. So all the more reason why the CNS is protected from big fluctuations